Shalom friends, welcome to this shiur in Talmud. We're studying Masechet Berachot, dealing with blessings, and that's really the theme of everything that we're learning about in this Masechet. I'm Eliyahu Shir, and I'm coming to you from Chesed Emet. You can find my site on www.lovingkindness.co, and we're broadcasting from the holy city of Yerushalayim. Now, we're studying from the Koren Talmud Bavli, which is edited by or used with the translation of Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. And as you can see, it's a very beautiful edition. We're going to make use of it, especially as we progress through certain parts of our text, which might be a little bit complicated. We'll obviously make more use of the explanation on the side to help us understand the themes that are happening. And I invite you to follow along with me. As you see, the original text is on the side of the page, together with translation and explanation, as well as on the side of the page, we're going to find additional notes, biographies, and pictures, images, photographs, etc., which are all there to help us to understand the text in an easier manner. So here we are, we're learning in the Mishnah about various breaks that occur during the Keriat Shema and what type of interruptions we are allowed to make during the various breaks. This is the part that we've actually got up to. We're on Daf Yud Dalet Amud Aleph, that's 14 side A. We're just about to move on to 14 side B. And we just finished off a section which dealt with dreams. And we spoke about the idea that a person who is not visited with a dream during a 7-day period, this is a bad sign for him. Maybe he himself is bad, or maybe it's a bad sign for him, whatever the case may be. So in actual fact, dreaming is a good thing. And that's what we left off with last week, that we really hope that we always have a dream, at least with one dream within a period of 7 days. And somebody who doesn't have a dream within a period of 7 days, so he has this problem, which is considered either he's evil or it's a bad sign for him, whatever we are talking about. And so we continue in our discussion from the Mishnah. Elu hein bein haprakim. These are the breaks between the different paragraphs of the Keriat Shema, where of course we would be entitled to make a break ourselves and to greet somebody, or alternatively to answer somebody who was greeting us. Now, at this point in time, for those who don't know what the discussion is all about, if we take a look on the notes over here, we can see that according to the first Tana, one may interrupt between the last paragraph of Shema and the blessing that follows it. But Rabbi Yehuda prohibits this. Let us just put this into perspective again. Whenever the Gemara speaks about Rabbi Yehuda, we're not speaking about Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishnah. We're speaking about Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli, who was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and in fact he was the teacher of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So whenever we see the name Rabbi Yehuda that's mentioned in the Gemara just by itself, we're speaking about Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. Omar Rabbi Abahu, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Said Rabbi Abahu that Rabbi Yochanan said the following: Halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the Omar, that he said, Bein Elokeichem le'emet VeYatziv lo yafsik. That when a person is in the middle of davening and he finishes off his Keriat Shema, Hashem Elokeichem emes, and then immediately afterwards he begins the next paragraph, which deals with the redemption from Egypt, coming out of Egypt. It starts off and says Emet VeYatziv, etc., etc. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha is that one may not make an interruption between the words Elokeichem and then afterwards Emet VeYatziv. One may not make an interruption here. Omar Rabbi Abahu said, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said, My ta'amei de Rabbi Yehuda. What is the reason for Rabbi Yehuda that he said that one may not make an interruption between the words Hashem Elokeichem to the next paragraph, Emes, where we start off the next paragraph? Because he answers on Daf Yud Dalet Amud Beis, V'Hashem Elokim Emes. The verse says in Yirmiyahu, and the Lord God is true. So we see over here it says Hashem Elokim Emes. Therefore, if we say Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and even though the next paragraph begins with the word Emes, and so it seems to be that it's a division between the two paragraphs where a person would be entitled to make an interruption, a hefsek, he may not make a hefsek, because the reason is in the verse, in the book of Yirmiyahu, the verse says Vashem Elokim Emes. So we see that the word Elokim, Emes are joined together, and therefore one may not make an interruption. Take a look at this note here in the halacha. One may not interrupt between Elokeichem and Emes VeYatziv. One may not interrupt or pause between the end of the third paragraph of Shema and the beginning of the following blessing, Emet VeYatziv, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, brought down there in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch or Achaim. You can go and check it out in more detail if it interests you. Or as always, if you're interested to know more about the halakha, please feel free to be in touch with me, and I'll be delighted to share more information about how this halakha comes out and how we paskin practically as we see it mentioned in Orach Chaim, and how the Mishnah Berurah speaks about it, and so on and so forth. So far we've got over here, don't make an interruption, says Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. And so is the halacha. Chozer v'omer emes. The Gemara asks the question, should he return afterwards? He says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. Then afterwards he waits, and he's going to continue now on the paragraph. The question is, when he continues, should he return and say, emes VeYatziv, etc., etc., or Eino Chozer v'omer emes? Or perhaps he shouldn't return and say emes, which means to say, he says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. Then afterwards, does he say emes VeYatziv, or does he just say VeYatziv v'nachon, etc., etc.? Omar Rabbi Abahu said, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said, Chozer v'omer emes. He returns and he says the word emes. Ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. Emes VeYatziv, and he carries on. Rabba Omar, Rabba said, remember once again, Rabba and Rava are two different rabbis. Rabba is actually the teacher of Rava, and he's also the teacher of Abaye. Now, Rabba said, Eino Chozer v'omer emes. He says one doesn't return and say the word emes, which means he says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem emes, and then immediately afterwards he continues, VeYatziv, etc. Hahu denaches kamed Rabba. Now the Gemara brings in a story and says to us that there was this fellow that went down in front of Rabba. What does it mean that he went down? In the old days, it seems to be that the bima, the place from where the chazan would daven, was on a slightly lower level than the general level of where people were standing, because the verse says, Mima makim kerasicha Hashem. The verse says that from the depths I call out to Hashem, which means to say that when a person is davening, he should daven from a slightly lower area than everybody else, meaning as the chazan, he should daven at a slightly lower area. So therefore the custom is, as we see in the Gemara, that whenever it says the naches, that he went down, it refers to the fact that he was going to daven as the shaliach tzibur in the community that was run by Rabba. Remember, Rabba said over here, he should not return and say the word emes, and here somebody went down to daven. Shema'ei Rabba, the Amar emes trei zimnei. Rabba heard that this fellow said the word emes 2 times. Omar Rabba said, call emes tfasei lahai. This was the sense of humor that the sages of the Talmud had, that they also had a good sense of humor. And he said over here, Rabba says, every emes, emes and emes, 2 different emeses, have they caught on to this one? In other words, he believes that he needs to recite that God is true. God is true. How many times do you have to say it? If you said that God is true, then God is true. That's the truth. That's what it is. How many times do you have to say it? So he said over here, he must be passionate about the pursuit of truth. He was joking. And he said, such an individual who's davening for the tzibur, and he felt the necessity to have to say the word emes 2 times, must be that he believes that he's really holding on to the fact that truth is something that is so important. Says the halacha over here, he does not repeat emes. One who concluded the last paragraph of Shema with the word emes and stopped due to respect or fear need not repeat emes when he begins to recite the blessing of Emet VeYatziv in accordance with the statement and the practice of Rabbah, as we paskin in the halacha, brought down over there as we see in the Shulchan Aruch. The notes, emes, one who repeats the word true following his recitation of the Shema does not thereby reinforce his declaration. Rather, on the contrary, he undermines the unity of the truth. It is similar to one who repeats Shema. Another thing that is forbidden for us is we may not say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Shema Yisrael Hashem. You're not allowed to say that. Also, one may not say Shema Shema Yisrael. We may not say the word Shema Shema twice, because that implies perhaps that we're davening as if there are two different entities, two different gods. So somebody says Emet, it's as if it's almost like he's acknowledging to two different entities, and this is forbidden therefore. Omar Rav Yosef said, Kama aliyah ha shematata. How great is that statement? He's teaching us a new principle. Dechi asa Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda. And once it happened that Rav Shmuel, the son of Yehuda, came, in other words, where did he come from? He came from Eretz Israel to Bavel. And while he was visiting in Bavel, Omar, he said, Omri b'ma'arava. They say in the west. The west, of course, is in Eretz Israel, the west of Bavel, Arvis, in the evening. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'omarta alehim ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. In Eretz Israel, the custom was that when it came to reciting the third paragraph of the Keriat Shema, they would recite it as follows. They would not recite the entire paragraph as we have it today. Instead, they would say, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Hashem, your God, true. And that's what they would say. Fine. Let us take notes of the notes on the side here. In Eretz Israel, they say, that sequence of verses as recited in Eretz Israel creates various problems. Many commented on the halakhic problems inherent in truncating and dividing verses, says the Rashba. Some explained that although the passage recited is a fragment of the verse in Numbers, it does not constitute an entire verse in Leviticus 18:2. That is why Rav Yosef, as we're going to see in a moment, was excited by this combination of verses. It was accomplished without dividing the verse, and he brings down the Yad HaMelech and other commentaries. So what happened over here is he was very excited by this idea that instead of reciting the entire paragraph, that third paragraph of the Keriat Shema, they would just simply say, Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'omarta alahim ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. Omar le Abaye said to him, my ma'aliyusa, what is the advantage of this particular verse? Vaha Omar Rav Kahana, Omar Rav, but didn't Rav Kahana say that Rav said, Lo yatchil. Actually, he should not begin to say this at all. The Emet chil, but if he does begin the third paragraph, gomer, he should say the third paragraph in its entirety. The key tema, and if you say, V'omarta alehim lo havei hatkala, maybe you'll say that if the person says just these words, V'omarta alehim, that there he has not yet begun the third paragraph and therefore he's still okay. V'ho amar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Omar Rav, but didn't Rav Shmuel, the son of Yitzchak, say that Rav said, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, if a person says the words, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, Lo havei hatkala, it is not considered to be a beginning. V'omarta alehim, but however, once a person says the words, and you shall say to them, havei hatkala, it is the beginning. And since it is the beginning, one must recite the entire third paragraph in its entirety. Omar Rav Papa said, Kasavri b'ma'arava, they held in the west, meaning in Eretz Israel, V'omarta alehim, that when a person says the words, and you shall say to them, Nami lo havya hatkala, this too is not to be considered as a beginning. Ad to Omar, until a person says, Va'asu lahem tzitzit. Once a person says, and you shall make for themselves tzitzit. So then at that point in time, they shall make for themselves tzitzit. At that point in time, he has for sure begun the third paragraph and must complete it. And therefore, since he didn't yet say those words, he has not yet begun the third paragraph, and he doesn't yet have to say the full paragraph. Omar Abaye, so Abaye said, Hilkach, therefore, Ananat chulei matchilinan. We make a big start. We make the start. Atchuli matchilinan. We make the start. Zaka matchilei b'marava. That it's just as it is that they began in the west. V'keivan aschilinan. And just now, since it is that we begin Migmar Nami Gamrinan. We complete the entire third paragraph, said Abaye in Bavel. Daha Omar Rav Kahana Omar Rav. That is what Rav Kahana said, that Rav said, Lo Yatchil, don't begin the Emet. And if one does begin the third paragraph, Gomer, he completes the third paragraph in its entirety. So says Abaye, and therefore that is the custom. Once already we said, Vayom Hashem El Moshe Daber B'nai Yisrael. Once we say Daber, that's it. Once we say, immediately once we begin, we must complete the paragraph in its entirety. The Gemara continues. Chia bar Rav Omar. Chia, the son of Rav, said, Omar, if a person said, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, if he says those words, Tzarich Lomar Emes. He must say the word Emes at the end of the Shema. It is not sufficient that he says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and he ends it there. Well, in fact, when we look at that third paragraph and we read it from the Torah, there is no word Emet next to it. And therefore, a person might come to think that all that he has to do is to say, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. Where does he get the custom from? He must say Emet. Because we learned in the previous verse that we saw in the book of Yirmiyahu, Ani Hashem Elokim Emes. I am God true. So since it says in Yirmiyahu, Emes is joined to that, we must join it. Tzarich lomar Emes. He must say the word Emes. Lo amar Ani Hashem Elokeichem. If he didn't say those words, he didn't say Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Eino tzarich lomar Emet. He wouldn't be required to say the Emet. He only has to say the Emet if he says Ani Hashem Elokeichem, because then we see from the pasuk in Yirmiyah that the two must go together. Ani Hashem Elokim Emes. That goes together. Now, the Gemara asks the question and says, isn't it required that we make mention of the Exodus of Egypt, which comes to imply that I should recite the entire paragraph that follows afterwards, and I shouldn't just cut it down as if I'm making just a few words to say instead of the paragraph. To Omar Hachi, that he said this, Moidim anachnu lecha Hashem Elokeinu shehotzeitzanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, that what he really said for that, in other words, the paragraph that follows after the third paragraph of Keriat Shema, he would say like this, Modim anachnu lecha, we give thanks to you, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem our God, shehotzeitzanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, that you've taken us out of the land of Egypt, ubrisanu mibeis avadim, and you've redeemed us from the house of slavery, va'asisa lanu nisim, and you have made for us miracles, ugavuros al hayam, and you've done mighty things by the sea, v'sharnu lach, and we sang out to you. Omar Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha. So that's it. So that was it. That was the end of the idea. And the point of the matter was, according to these authorities over here, what happened is, instead of reciting the entire paragraph where we say Ani Hashem Elokeichem Emes VeYatziv v'Nachon, etc., etc., so he said over here we could say instead a short paragraph and not have to worry with the lengthier paragraph that we have the custom to say. He says, as this formula includes all of the content comprising Emes ve'emunah, well, we don't really do this. We say the full paragraph as it appears in the Siddur, but this is what they would do, and this is how they would get away with the idea of still making mention of the Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Gemara continues. Omar Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha, Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha said the following, new section, Lama kadma parashat Shema v'chulei. why is the paragraph of Shema preceding the next paragraph? In other words, we first say, Shema, v'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, then afterwards, v'haya im shamua, and then afterwards, Daber b'nei Yisrael with the parsha that deals with tzitzit. Rabbi Yehuda ben Korach is coming to teach us the order of the parshiyot. And he asked the question, why is it that the order of the parshiyot follows the structure that we have today as we pronounce it, as we read it in the Siddur? Tanya, it was taught in a Braisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, the great Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says the following. V'din hu, isn't it so, by rights, that sheyakdim Shema le v'haya im shamua, we should really precede the Shema to v'haya im shamua, shezeh lilmod, because in the first paragraph, where we speak about v'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, etc., it deals with the mitzvah of studying Torah. V'zeh lelamed, and the second paragraph deals with teaching Torah. V'haya im shamua le vayomer. Why do we say v'haya im shamua before vayomer? The reason is because shezeh lilmod v'zeh la'asot. Because this one has to do with learning, and this one has to do with doing. Those who look in the original text of the Gemara will note that over here in this particular point, there is a mistake in the text, and it should not say shezeh lilmod, but shezeh lelamed, obviously, because shezeh lilmod v'zeh lelamed, it must follow and continue. Shezeh lelamed v'zeh la'asos. This one is to speak about teaching, and this one is to speak about doing. So the order is lilmod ulelamed v'la'asos. First we study, then we do, then we teach, and then we do. That is the progression here. According to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the order of the paragraphs of Keriat Shema goes in accordance with this principle: study, teach, and do. Therefore, first we begin, v'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, then v'haya im shamua, then vayomer. The Gemara continues. Atu Shema, is it to say that when we say the first paragraph of Shema, lilmod ispei, that it has this idea of study, to learn, lelamed v'la'asos leispei? Is it true that there is no such a thing in the first paragraph dealing with teaching and doing? That it isn't there? V'hakasiv, but it's written in the first paragraph. V'shinantam ukeshartam ukesavtam, and you shall teach them, and you shall learn them. You shall teach them, and you shall put them on you shall wear them as tefillin, ukesavtam, and you shall write them. So we see that there are basically these three elements here. Shinantam is teaching. It's not just sufficient to say it's learning, it's also teaching. Ukeshartam is dealing with action of the tefillin. Ukesavtam, dealing with the action of the mezuzah. V'tu, and further, v'haya im shamua, when we speak about the paragraph of v'haya im shamua, the second paragraph of Keriat Shema. Lelamed hu de'isbei, see here again, lelamed. Yeah, it says lilmod. This is incorrect. The word there should say lelamed. It's not an error within the Steinsaltz edition by any means. It is an error within the way that it was originally published in the original text. They keep to that error. And then if you read the original, you'll notice on the side margin where it corrects it and says it should say lelamed. So v'haya im shamua has lelamed hu de'isbei. It has within its teaching, says the Gemara, v'la'asos leispei, and it doesn't have to do, meaning to say the third paragraph has to do with doing, but not the second paragraph. Is that what you're saying? V'hakasiv, but it's written, ukeshartam, and you shall bind them, meaning the mitzvah of tefillin. Ukesavtam, and you shall write them on the doorposts of the house, referring to the mezuzah. Therefore, we see that that appears in the second paragraph of the Shema. So it's unfair to say that the first paragraph deals with lilmod, the second paragraph deals with lelamed, and the third paragraph deals with la'asot. As if to say, first we study, then we teach, and then we do. Because even within the first paragraph, we have teaching and doing. And the second paragraph too, we have teaching and doing. So therefore, what is the logic behind the idea of learning, teaching, and doing for the order of the paragraphs when, practically speaking, all three paragraphs are dealing with the same concepts? There is no order of precedence that makes the one paragraph more important, no order of moving forward from one thing to the next. But rather, this is what it said. This is how it works. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was saying the following: Bedinhu, by right, shetikdam shma levahaya im shamua, that we should proceed, a person should precede the shma to vahaya im shamua. Why? Shezeh lilmod lamed vela'asos. Because in the first paragraph of Shema, we deal with learning, with teaching, and action, doing. V'haya im shamua le vayomer. But when we speak about the mitzvah of v'haya im shamua to vayomer, the paragraphs, the order of the paragraphs, the second paragraph to the third paragraph, shezeh yesh bo lelamed velasot, that in it there is the concept of teaching and doing. Vayomer ein ba ela la'asos bilvad. But in the third paragraph, we only have the idea of doing. There is no mitzvah there. There is no line that speaks about learning, and there is no line that speaks about teaching, only about action. Therefore, in the first paragraph, actually, we have all three concepts. In the second paragraph, we have two concepts. And in the third paragraph, we only have one concept. And therefore, first comes the first paragraph as we know about it. Second comes the second paragraph as we know. And then third comes the paragraph of the tzitzit, which is in accordance with the way that we do things. The Gemara continues. V'teipok lei mid Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha. Hang on a second. But deduce this from the teaching of what Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha said. What did he say? Chada v'od ka'amar. One thing and another can be said. What is that? Chada, 1 point. Kedei sheyekabel alav ol malkut shamayim techila. The first thing is, do you know why we first begin with Shema Yisrael and then V'ahavta, and then afterwards we move on to V'haya im Shamoa? Because the first paragraph speaks about accepting upon oneself the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. First I accept upon myself the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. V'acharkach, and afterwards, Yekabel alav all mitzvahs. A person should accept upon himself the yoke of mitzvahs, which means to say, think about it for a second. If we're going to be observing mitzvahs, the first thing that we need to do is to accept upon ourselves a king. Once we accept upon ourselves the king, then afterwards we can fulfill the mitzvahs. But so long as we have no king, we cannot fulfill any mitzvahs because we don't know what we should do. And in any case, so long as one hasn't accepted the king, practically speaking, it doesn't matter what mitzvah he commands. Because if we didn't accept him as the king, we're not going to listen to his mitzvahs in any case, his commandments. Therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha, the first thing is, accept upon oneself the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Second, accept upon oneself the yoke of the mitzvahs. And I move ahead, and now I'm going to perform the mitzvot. V'od. And another reason as to why the order of the paragraphs of the Shema fall out like they do is mishum te'isbahane milei acharana yasa. Because it also has within it these words that we learnt about afterwards, of the idea that there's lilmod, lamed, vela'asot, etc., etc. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha gives us two reasons as to the order of the three paragraphs of Shema. One thing for sure is we need to accept upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. Afterwards, we accept mitzvahs. And then, in addition to this, we can also use the reasoning of what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai taught us, that ultimately in the first paragraph are three concepts, making it very important. In the second paragraph are two concepts, making it slightly less important, but at least more important than the third paragraph, which is dealing with only one aspect, la'asot, the mitzvah of tzitzit. Let us take a look over here at the bottom, some extra information for us. Who are the personalities of the Gemara that we're learning about? The first person is Chia bar Rav. Who was Chia bar Rav? A Babylonian Amoira, the son of Rav. Although Rav had additional descendants, only Chia followed in his footsteps and became one of the prominent sages of his generation. We know that during Rav's life as well as after his death, Rav's students looked after Chia. Even Rav's close friend Shmuel treated Chia fondly because of his relationship with his father. Rav loved his son dearly And even when he was a child, Rav took great pleasure in his son's wisdom. Since Chia suffered from ill health, Rav gave him various bits of medical advice. Chia's son, Rav Shimi Bar Chia, was among the great Amorim of the next generation. Who was Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, one of the elder Tanaim in the generation of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel II. Many commentaries, as Tosafot and others, identify him as Rabbi Yeshua, the son of Rabbi Akiva, but others question this. Some people say that Rabbi Akiva was bald, and so therefore Rabbi Yeshua Bar Korcha was named such as Rabbi Yeshua, the son of the bald one, referring to his father being Rabbi Akiva. Other people say that's not true. That is just his name, Ben Korcha, but not necessarily that his father was Rabbi Akiva, who was the bald one. Little is known of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha's personality, and relatively few statements of halacha or agada were cited in his name. Remember, halacha is the law, and the agada is the stories, the homiletical parts of the Gemara that give a little bit of substance and excitement to the Gemara that we're learning. So again, we see over here that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha is not really quoted all that much in terms of his halacha or agada. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha lived such a long life that he blessed Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. May it be God's will that you reach half my days. Because he lived such a long life, he can be found in exchanges with sages from several generations. By the end of his life, he was accepted and respected by all. The sages of his generation sought his blessing, and he would take the initiative to seek out others and offer them his guidance. Let us continue. The Gemara continues now with a new theme. So we finished, in other words, with the idea of the order of the paragraphs. We've also finished with regards to the breaks that we have within the paragraphs of Keriat Shema, and what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, and where we're allowed to put those breaks. And as we see, as we just ended off a few moments ago, that the time of Emet VeYatziv, when we get to that, we may not make a break according to Rabbi Yehuda, because there it's important to join the two words together, even though with the other paragraphs, when we finish a paragraph, we may certainly make an interruption, as we learned before we begin the next paragraph. The Gemara continues, Rav Mashay Yedei. It tells us another story. Here is a bit of Agadata. Here is the storyline. Stories, Rav Mashay Yedei Ukra Keriat Shema. Rav would wash his hands, and then he would read the Keriat Shema. Va'anak tefillin, then he would put on tefillin, v'tzalei, and he would daven. Now we're trying to learn out over here an order of the way that we should do things. According to Rav, the correct order is as follows. Wash your hands before you're going to pray, as is the custom. For those who are careful, it's very praiseworthy that before we daven any tefillah, we should really wash our hands, make sure they're clean physically and clean ritually. In other words, in a pure state. By washing and pouring the water over the hands 3 times, one can affect that particular condition. And those who are careful will wash before Shachris, before Mincha, and before Mariv. And should they touch any part of the body that shouldn't be touched, as the halakha goes into great detail and tells us, they would wash their hands again, of course, but hopefully they wouldn't end up doing that, and the hands will remain pure for the entire duration of the tefillah. So Rav would wash his hands, let's listen carefully, and then he would read the Keriat Shema, and then he would put on tefillin, and then he would daven the Shmona Esrei. The Gemara asks the question, how did he do this? Meaning, well, what made him do this? Very strange thing over here. On the one hand, he goes to wash his hands, he reads the Keriat Shema, and then he puts the tefillin on. This is very strange. Anybody who knows anything about halakha would know that, of course, reciting the Keriat Shema without tefillin is a big problem altogether. Yet Rav, the great Amora Rav, would come along and he would wash his hands, do Keriat Shema, and then put on his tefillin, and then he would pray. The Gemara asks, how did he do that? V'hatanya, and wasn't it taught in a Baraita, in another teaching, which is outside of the Mishnah? It says over there, a great teaching. Ha'chifer kuch lemeis bekever, a person who is digging out a plot, an area for a dead person, somebody who died now and has to be buried, and they make a grave for him. So in the old days, as we're going to see in a minute, they would bury them inside a type of a inside a wall, as we're going to see in a moment. It wasn't underground, but it was inside a wall area. So somebody who's digging out this area, Patur Mikriyat Shema, he is exempt from reciting the Kriyat Shema, Umin HaTefillah, and even from davening Shmona Esrei, Umin HaTefillin, and also he doesn't have to wear tefillin. Umikol mitzvahs ha'amuros b'Torah, and in all mitzvahs that are written in the Torah, any mitzvah that we speak about, if a person is occupied with one mitzvah, he is exempt from another mitzvah. If a person is busy preparing a grave for a dead body to bury it, and it's time for the Kriyat Shema, he does not have to abandon his post. He has a mitzvah at hand. They have to bury this person. And therefore he is exempt from the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and even from tefillah and all mitzvahs. Because one who is engaged in one mitzvah is exempt. He doesn't have to do another mitzvah. We only have one body. We can only perform one mitzvah at one point in time. A person who is engaged in the mitzvah of burying somebody is exempt from another mitzvah, meaning Kriyat Shema. Higiyas man Kriyat Shema. Now, if the time comes for the reading of the Kriyat Shema, says this particular braita, Ole v'notel yadav. He goes up, which means he stops doing this burial, and he washes his hands. Umaniach tefillin, then he puts on tefillin. V'korei Kriyat Shema, then he reads the Kriyat Shema. Umitpalel, and then he davens the Shmona Esrei. According to this teaching, what is the correct order? First, he's going to put on tefillin, then he's going to read the Kriyat Shema, and then he's going to daven. So would be the correct custom. Yet Rav would wash his hands, then he would read the Kriyat Shema, and then he would put on his tefillin. But the Brisa says that's not how it's done. Fine. Let us see on the side over here, what's the halacha? He washed his hands and recited Shema. If due to circumstances beyond his control, we're going to learn about this a little bit later, so we'll come back to that halacha. One who digs a grave for the dead, one who is engaged in digging a grave for the deceased, is exempt from reciting Shema. If there are two people digging the grave, and it is impossible for them to dig together, while one is digging, the other should recite Shema, and vice versa. So we're going to see that in a minute. Sorry, we've jumped the gun over here to look at this note. If it is possible for them to dig together, they are both, if possible, then they are both exempt from having to do the mitzvah of reciting the Kriyat Shema. Let's take a look here on the background. A grave for the dead, kuch lemeis, the coffins or sarcophagi were placed in compartments chiseled in the cave walls. The grave would typically be hewn long in advance. However, on occasion, they would only begin to dig when the individual died, in which case the work was urgent. You can see over here, this is how they used to bury the dead. They would make an opening over here into the wall itself, and the person would be buried inside the wall, not inside the ground, as is the custom today. Talmudic era burial cave in Beit She'an. Okay, so let's first read on in the Gemara, and we'll come back to these notes because I see we've jumped the gun at looking at these notes and we're missing out on the story. First, the Gemara says, Ha'gufa kasha. Hold on a second. The very point of the statement, the text itself, is difficult to understand. Reisha Omar Patur. In the first part of the Brisa, it said that somebody who was digging the grave was exempt from reciting the Kriyat Shema. The Sefer Chayav. And in the end of this Braita, it says he's obligated. It says, now the time for Kriyat Shema comes, he stops what he's doing, and off he goes, and he reads the Kriyat Shema. Answers the Gemara. Ha'lo kashya. This is not a difficulty at all. Sefer betray. When the Braita was teaching us the second part, the end part of this Braita, it was talking about a case where there are two people involved in the burial. V'reisha b'chad. And in the first part of the Mishnah, where it's a Braita, where it spoke about the idea that a person who's burying does not have to go and recite the Kriyat Shema, that's talking about one person. In other words, when there is one person involved in the mitzvah of burying this dead person, then it comes out that when the time for the Kriyat Shema comes about, he does not have to remove himself from the mitzvah at hand and go and say Kriyat Shema. However, if there are two people involved in the mitzvah and only one person is needed to be involved in the burial, then the other person will excuse himself at the time of Kriyat Shema. He will go and recite the Kriyat Shema while the other person continues with the burial, and thereafter, when he has finished Kriyat Shema, he will go back and continue with the burial, the digging in other words, while the other person goes and he recites the Keriat Shema. And therefore, although the Breita was taught in such a concise manner, nevertheless, it had two different meanings. The first part of the Breita was speaking about one person. The second part of the Breita was speaking about two people involved in the mitzvah. And that is what it was talking about over here, where it says one who digs a grave for the dead, that if two people were needed, both of them are needed in order to do the burial, then of course, both of them are exempt. Mikol makom, the Gemara continues, and nevertheless, kasher l'Rav. This is difficult according to Rav. Why? Because in any case, it says over here that Rav would wash his hands, and then he would read the Keriat Shema, and then he would put tefillin and pray. But according to the Breita, that is not the correct way of doing it. The first thing to do is when the time for Keriat Shema comes about, he goes and he washes his hands, and then afterwards he puts on tefillin, and then he reads the Keriat Shema and he davens. And so therefore, no matter what way we look at it, it is still a difficulty according to the way that Rav did things. The Gemara answers, Rav, Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha, sevir elei. Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha, as we learned about on the previous page. Who was Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha? To Omar, that Rabbi Yehuda ben Korcha, in other words, said, all Malchut Shamayim Techila, first, a person should accept upon himself the heavenly yoke, the yoke of the heavenly kingdom of heaven. Techila, first he does that. And afterwards, all mitzvot. And then he goes ahead and he accepts upon himself the yoke of the mitzvot. So first of all, he has to accept upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And then afterwards, he accepts upon himself mitzvot. Isn't that what we learned about before? The order of the paragraphs of the Shema was the same type of idea. First we speak about lilmod, then we speak about lilamed, then we speak about lastot, which means study, teaching, and then doing. Well, if it's study, teaching, and doing, then isn't it correct to say that the first thing we should do is to accept upon ourselves, like in the Keriat Shema, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and then afterwards we put on tefillin? Shouldn't that be the correct way of doing it? Well, I'd like to share something with you, which is quite fascinating, and you can make of it what you feel you'd like to make of it. Take a look at what this says over here. You should see on the screen a screen showing the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, chapter 23, and we're looking at verse 24. And over here, the verse says the following. The verse says that with regards to Bilam cursing the Jewish people, which of course he didn't do, as we know, he blessed the Jewish people. Bilam says in his prophecy, Hein am kalavi yakum, they are a nation that arise like a lion. V'ka'ari yisnasa, and they come up, they leap up like another type of lion. The word lavi, the word ari, they're just different names expressing different attributes of the nature of the lion. Lo yishkav, this nation, the Jewish people, do not lie down. Ad yochal terif, until they eat the prey. V'dam chalalim yishteh, and the blood of the slain it will drink. Rashi says a very interesting thing. As we see over here on the side, I'm just looking at the Rashi here, I can't really go higher, but we're looking at the Rashi on the right-hand side of the screen. He says, Hein am kalavi yakum. They are like a nation that get up like a lion. Kesheheinundim mishnasam, says Rashi, when they arise from their sleep, shakris, in the morning, Hein miskabrin kalavi, they get up as strong like a lion. V'ka'ari, and they're like a lion. Laktof et mitzvot, to fulfill the mitzvahs. Look how interesting Rashi is over here. He says, Laktof et mitzvot, lilbosh talit, the first thing that they do is they wear a talis. Likro et shema, look at the words of Rashi. He says, then they read the Shema, ula'aniach tefillin, and then they put tefillin on. Now this is very strange. Why in the world did Rashi come along to say in this verse that the Jewish people are considered like lions when they come to serve Hashem. Why are they like lions? Because the first thing that they do in the morning, they get up with strength and they put on their talis, then they read the Shema, and then they put on tefillin. He should have clearly have said, first they put on tefillin, and then they read the Keriat Shema. Why in the world did Rashi come along and say the first thing that they do is they read the Shema, and then they put on tefillin? Fascinating. Now, when we go back to our verse, when we go back to our Gemara over here, this is exactly what happened to Rav. Rav washed his hands, and then afterwards he recited the Keriat Shema, and only afterwards he put on tefillin, just exactly in accordance with Rashi is telling us. So we said over here that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha is holding like the idea of first accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and only afterwards do they accept the yoke of the mitzvot. So that would be the correct example, the correct understanding, that the first thing to do is to say Shema Yisrael, I acknowledge God, and then afterwards I perform mitzvot. How come? Because why would I perform mitzvot if I had not yet accepted the yoke of heaven? Once again, we go back to square one again. First, I must accept that there is a king. Once I accept the king, then of course I can observe his mitzvot. But if I don't acknowledge the king, there is no purpose to his mitzvot, and in fact it is highly unlikely I will fulfill the mitzvot of the king. Amar the Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, say that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha said the following: Lakdim kriya lekriya. You know what? Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha was not speaking about the aspect of the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, and then afterwards actually doing a mitzvah. He was talking about the order of the paragraphs in the Keriat Shema. Lakdim kriya lekriya. First we proceed one reading to the next. Kriya la'asiya, meaning first we read it in this way. Kriya la'asiya mi sham'at lei. But do you think that maybe he could have been speaking about this idea of reading to actual action? He wasn't speaking about that. He was speaking about the idea of the order of the paragraphs of Keriat Shema. When we read the Keriat Shema, we read it in the order of first accepting the yoke of heaven, and then afterwards we speak about the fulfillment of the mitzvot, and that's well and good. Everything is fine. But when it comes to the actual implementation, shouldn't it be that first we put the tefillin on, and then we recite the Keriat Shema? The two, and further than this, Mi Savar Lei Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Is this that Rav held according to the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi. Didn't Rabbi Chia bar Ashi say the following? In other words, in any case, who said that Rav was holding by Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha's opinion? Rav Chia, the son of Ashi. He said the following: Zimnin Sagi'in. There were many times. Hava ka'ameina kamei Rav, that I would be standing in front of Rav, the rabbi who is involved in the story, that he would wash his hands and then afterwards say Keriat Shema, and then afterwards he would put on his tefillin. He says he would go and watch him, as is the custom. Talmidei Chachamim watch their rebbes to see what they're doing, and then when they see the rebbe behaving in a certain way, they know what the right thing is to do. Of course, presumably that the rebbe is a great man himself and has had shimush himself and engages in the mitzvot in the correct way, then the Talmud can learn from watching his behavior. So Rav Chia bar Ashi said that I would be standing in front of Rav many times. And I would see that the first thing would happen is he would start off and he would wash his hands. Then he would make the blessing on the washing of the hands, or the blessing, I should say. In fact, the blessing would be perhaps on the blessing of Torah. And then he would teach us the chapter of learning that we were doing. What would happen afterwards? Umanach tefillin. Afterwards, he would put on tefillin. V'hadar karei Keriat Shema. And afterwards, he would recite the Keriat Shema. According to Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, he said that I would watch Rav many times. And I can tell you, when we were learning, he would go and wash his hands. He'd be teaching us. After he taught us, Mishnah, he would then go ahead and he would put on his tefillin, and afterwards he would read the Keriat Shema. This is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. And then do we say, therefore, that Rav was holding like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha in any case, that first we precede the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, and then afterwards we do the mitzvah? No, we're talking about a different scenario altogether. The key tema, and if you want to say, but the law matazman Keriat Shema, that perhaps the time of the Keriat Shema did not yet come about. In other words, since the time of Keriat Shema was not yet around, therefore in this instance, what did Rav do? He put on his tefillin. Then he waited for the correct time to recite the Shema, and then he recited the Keriat Shema, which means to say that could be a reason as to why he behaved in this way, and why Rav Chia bar Ashi saw him behave in this way. If so, my azhadasei the Rav Chia bar Ashi. Then why would I need the testimony of Rav Chia bar Ashi to tell us this whole story? Answers the Gemara. Le'apuke miman de'amar. This comes to exclude from the one who said, leMishnah ein tzarich levarech, that if a person is learning only Mishnah, he does not have to make the bracha for learning Torah. Those of us who've been part of the shiurim from the beginning will remember that we dealt with the section earlier on, which spoke about the fact as a question as to what degree do I have to recite a bracha on the study of Torah? Do I have to recite a bracha if I'm learning Tanakh? Do I have to recite a bracha if I'm learning Mishnah or Talmud? What do I have to recite a bracha on? Those people that hold that you wouldn't have to recite a bracha if it was only Mishnah that you were learning make a mistake. And that is what the testimony of Rav Chia bar Ashi is coming to teach us, that indeed, even if a person is only learning Mishnah, he must still make the bracha on the study of Torah. Kamash Malan comes to teach us the Avle Mishnah Nami Tzarich Levarech, that even if a person is only studying Mishnah, still we need to make a bracha. So is the custom, of course, as we've learned many, many times already, that actually the correct way of doing things is that when we wake up in the morning, we recite the bracha for studying Torah on everything that we're going to learn that day, and we do not study any Torah whatsoever until we have recited that bracha. Mikol makom, says the Gemara, in any case, kasher l'Rav, this is still difficult according to Rav. Which means to say, at the end of the day, we don't have an answer yet. This whole story is difficult to understand. What was Rav really doing over here? Rav went ahead, he washed his hands. After he washed his hands, he says Keriat Shema. After he says Keriat Shema, he puts on tefillin. None of this seems to make any sense. Answers the Gemara, Shluchahu da'avet. The answer to the problem as to what was seen at the time when Rav would wash his hands, and then he would say Keriat Shema, and only later he put on tefillin, is because the shaliach who brought the tefillin to Rav made a mistake. He brought the tefillin to Rav later on, and Rav did not want to miss out on the mitzvah of reciting the Keriat Shema in the correct time. As those of us who have been part of these shiurim from the beginning well know, that the Keriat Shema must be recited in a certain time period. And obviously he had a shaliach who was bringing the tefillin to him. Perhaps he was studying Torah early in the morning, and he didn't bring the tefillin with him to shul. And he expected that a particular shaliach would bring the tefillin to him. Or perhaps he forgot it. And he notified somebody, please go and tell somebody to bring me my tefillin, which I left behind. So they ran and they fetched it. And while they had gone, he was afraid maybe they're going to come back too late. So at that point in time, what did he do? He recited the Keriat Shema first. And then he put on tefillin. At least he fulfilled the mitzvah of Keriat Shema in the correct time. Not ideal, of course. Because as the Torah tells us, that a person who recites the Keriat Shema and he's not wearing his tefillin, it is like a false testimony. In the Keriat Shema, we say, and you shall wear them as a sign upon your hand and tutafot between your eyes. How can a person say those words in Keriat Shema if he's not wearing tefillin? So therefore, it seems to be like a false testimony. And therefore, a person should be careful that when it comes to reciting the Keriat Shema, that he's only doing so when he's actually got tefillin on. But what of the person who comes to shul and he realizes it's going to be a long time before he gets his tefillin? Should he miss out altogether on the mitzvah of Keriat Shema in the correct time? Rav was saying he didn't want to miss out on the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema in the correct time. And therefore, when the tefillin would come to him later, he would then put the tefillin on, and presumably he would recite the Kriyat Shema again, although it might have been out of time, out of the correct time, and at least he would fulfill his obligation before of having recited Kriyat Shema in the correct time, and now he puts the tefillin on, and that is how we are answering up this whole story as to what was going on. Let us go back to these halachot over here. He said that he washed his hands and recited the Shema, and we said over here he should not recite the blessing over them until after he completes his prayer. Others hold, that is when they are brought to him. Let's just go through it again. If due to circumstances beyond his control, we didn't read this yet. He washed his hands and recited Shema. If due to circumstances beyond his control, one's phylacteries, the tefillin, only became available after reciting Shema, he should don them immediately, even between the blessing of redemption and the start of the Amidah prayer. However, he should not recite the blessing over them until after he completes his prayer. Others hold that even in that case, he recites a blessing over them immediately, says the Pri Chadash, the Shulchan Aruch, or Chaim. You can check it out over there. One who digs a grave for the dead, as we've learned before, one who is engaged in digging a grave for the deceased is exempt from reciting Shema. If there are two people digging the grave and it is impossible for them to dig together while in that instance, while one is digging, then the other should recite the Shema, and vice versa. If it is possible for them to dig together, or they needed to dig together, in other words, they are both exempt. One who recites Shema without phylacteries, call Koren Kriyat Shema below tefillin, as we're going to learn a little bit later, one must don phylacteries while reciting the Shema. This is the grave, as we learned about, that they did. One who digs is exempt from reciting Shema from all the mitzvot mentioned in the Torah. There is an apparent redundancy in the Braita, as it teaches that one is exempt from the recitation of Shema and from all mitzvot mentioned in the Torah, given that the recitation of Shema itself is itself a mitzvah mentioned in the Torah. Its mention was unnecessary. Some explained that had the Braita merely stated from all mitzvahs mentioned in the Torah, one might have drawn the erroneous conclusion that it's referring only to those mitzvahs with no set time, which may therefore be postponed, not to mitzvahs like Shema, whose time will pass. As we see, it applies there also. Now, this is what we're going to say over here in this last sentence. Let us just finish it here. Omar Ula said, Kol HaKorei Kriyat Shema below tefillin. Anybody who recites the Kriyat Shema without wearing tefillin, Ke'ilu me'id edus sheker ba'atzmo. It's like a person who testifies falsely against himself. Omar Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, said Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Ke'ilu hikriv ola below mincha bezevach below nesachim. This is like a person who brought an offering of an oila offering without bringing the mincha, which must come and accompany it. Or like a person who brings the zevach, the slaughtered offering, and he doesn't bring the required libations, the nisachim, together with it. This means to say that it's incomplete. Two things. One could be that he's really acting in a derogatory way. That's number one. And number two, for sure, the mitzvah is incomplete. To fulfill the real mitzvah of the Kriyat Shema means to say it together with the tefillin. Anyone who recites Shema without phylacteries, it is as if he has borne false testimony against himself. The difference between the statements of Ula and Rabbi Yochanan is that according to Ula and Rabbi Yochanan, according to Ula, apparently reciting Shema without phylacteries is inherently flawed, as it is like false testimony. According to Rabbi Yochanan, that recitation is indeed lacking, but it may be remedied by donning phylacteries later, much like a libation or meal offering, which is added after the sacrifice. We're going to conclude over here, which is a great place to conclude. We've just finished off Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis, and in our next lesson, all being well, we'll begin Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph, which is page 15, side A. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Eliyahu Shir from Chesed VeEmet. You can find me, my site, on www.lovingkindness.co. If you've enjoyed the shiur, learned something from it, got something out of it, please like the shiur by clicking on the like button underneath this video, the thumbs up button to say that you've enjoyed it, you've got something out of it, and you've grown in some way from the shiur. If you'd like to make a comment, please do so. Anything that we can interact with, I'd be happy to answer and discuss any matters relating to the page that we're learning, or any matters of Torah that come across your mind while you're thinking of them as you go through this page. Please do share this video with your family and friends. Subscribe to my channel. Click on the bell button to be notified of future shiurim, and let others know about what we're doing. If you're able to, please come and see what we're doing on our site and become an active member in our activities by becoming a monthly member and contributing to what we're doing, helping us to be able to do more. And in the future, what we'd really like to do is to offer more shiurim as we're doing over here. These shiurim are not charged for, they're all free, and we want to give more of ourselves. So if you join our team, we'll be able to offer more shiurim and offer to more people as well. Thanks very much for joining me. I look forward to another shiur in the near future, and I'm always delighted to interact with you. So feel free to send me an email by visiting my site and going to the contact form and sending me something, and let's talk about Torah, let's talk about life, let's talk about growth, and grow together. The mistakes we make, it's okay, we'll overcome them and we'll succeed together as a team. Looking forward to another shiur, wishing you everything of the best. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.